to have a quick 45-minute little Locke stream. Don't have much time, but that's okay. Just need to make sure that the stream is on, need to make sure the stream is working. And we'll see what the delay is. Okay. It looks like we're good. We'll do a little double check here. A little triple check over on the YouTube. It's hard to do. It's hard to do this. I'd rather talk about politics. Politics is fun. It is interesting. It is zany. Politics is like playing chess. Whereas reading Locke is like not fun, right? Do we understand what I'm saying here? First, okay, so I'm going to guess the audio is working for everybody. And we're just going to go on with it. So let us settle ourselves. Let us organize ourselves here in Locke. Where were we? We were page 86. We were talking about innate laws. Innate laws are a big part here. So we're talking about punishments, transgressions, imprinting, extremes, and we are at number 14. The difference there is amongst men and their practical principles. It is so evident that I think I say no more to evince that it will be impossible to find any innate moral rules by this mark of general assent, and 'tis enough to make one suspect that the supposition of such innate principles is but an opinion taken up at pleasure, since those who talk so confidently of them are so sparing to tell us which they are. Audio but video. Does that mean there's no audio? Because from what I can see, we do have audio. I'm going to double check on that. Open up a new profile. Search Reading Locke. Click on the stream.
Pleasure. Since those who talk so
okay, well, I can hear the audio.
Are so sparing them
Whoa.
Audio but video.
What is going on?
Is that?
I think that's because I have this not on mute. So I don't know what you mean, Dio Strabo. I don't know how to solve that. Might just be you. Maybe if one of the other. Everything's fine. Okay. Thank you for scaring me. So we're talking about which innate principles exist. This might with justice be expected from those men who lay stress upon this opinion, and it gives occasion to distrust either their knowledge or charity, who, declaring that God has imprinted on the minds of men the foundations of knowledge and the rules of living, are yet so little favorable to the information of their neighbors or the quiet of mankind as not to point out to them which they are in the variety men are distracted with. But in truth, were there no such innate principles, there would be no need to teach them. Did men find such innate propositions stamped on their minds, they would easily be able to distinguish them from other truths that they afterwards learned and deduced from them, and there would be nothing more easy than to know what and how many they were. There could be no more doubt about their number than there is about the number of her fingers, and 'tis like then every system would be ready to give them us by tale. But since no body that I know has ventured yet to give a catalogue of them, they cannot blame those who doubt of the innate principles, since even they who require men to believe that there are such innate propositions do not tell us what they are. 'Tis easy to foresee that if different men of different sects should go about to give us a lift of those innate practical principles, they would set down only such as suited their distinct hypothesis and were fit to support the doctrines of their particular schools or churches, a plain evidence that there are no such innate truths. Nay, a great part of men are so far from finding such innate moral principles in themselves that by denying freedom to mankind, and thereby making men no other than bare machines, They take away not only innate but all moral rules whatsoever, and leave not a possibility to believe any such to those who cannot conceive how anything can be capable of a law that is not a free agent. And upon that ground, they must necessarily reject all principles of virtue, who cannot put morality and mechanism together, which are not very easy to be reconciled or made consistent. When I had writ this, being informed that my Lord Herbert had, in his books De Veritate, assigned these innate principles, I presently consulted him, hoping to find in a man of so great parts something that might falsify me in this point and put an end to my enquiry. And his chapter De in Instinctu Naturali, page 76, edition 1656, I met with these 6 marks of his Notitiae Communes. First, the Prioritas; 2, Independentia; 3, Universiates, Universalites; 4, Certitudo; 5, This is so difficult. Necessitas. I'm reading the English S plus the Latin is screwing with my brain. Necessitas, i.e., as he explains it, faciunt ad hominis conversationem. Number 6, modus conformationis, i.e., ascensus nulla interposita mora. And at the latter end of this little treatise, De Religione Laici, he says this of these innate principles: adeo ut non uni usvis, I have no clue what that is, religionis confinio arctentur quae ubique vigent veritates, sunt enim in ipsa mente coalitus descriptae nullisque traditionibus, sive scriptis, sive non scriptis obnoxiae. Page 3, and veritates nostrae catholicae quae tanquam indubia Dei essata in or effata in foro interiori descripta. Thus, having given the marks of the innate principles or common notions, and assented their being imprinted on the minds of men by the hand of God, he proceeds to set them down, and they are these: 1. Esse aliquod supremum numem. So sounds like the supremacy of numbers. Number 2, numen illud colli debere. Number 3, virtutem cum pietate conjunctam optimam esse rationem cultus divini. So something about divinity, rationality, and piety and virtue. Number 4, recipiscendum esse a peccatis. Number 5, dari praemium vel paenam post hanc vitam transanctam. Though I allow these to be clear truths, and such as, if rightly explained, a rational creature can hardly avoid giving his assent to, yet I think he is far from proving them innate impressions in foro interiori descriptae. For I must take leave to observe, first, that these 5 propositions are either not all, or more than all, those common notions writ on our minds by the finger of God, if it were reasonable to believe any at all to be so written, since there are other propositions which, even by his own rules, have as just a pretense to such an original, and may be as well admitted for innate principles as at least some of these 5 he enumerates, vis-a-vis, do as thou wouldest be done unto, and perhaps some hundreds of others when well considered. Secondly, that all his marks are not to be found in each of his 5 propositions, vis-a-vis his first, second, and third marks agree perfectly to neither of them, and the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth marks, fourth and sixth marks, I should say, we skip over the fifth, agree but ill to his third, fourth, and fifth propositions. For besides that we are assured from history of many men, nay, whole nations, who doubt or disbelieve some or all of them, I cannot see how the third, vis-a-vis, that virtue joined with piety is the best worship of God, can be an innate principle, when the name or sound virtue is so hard to be understood, liable to so much uncertainty in its signification, and the thing it stands for so much contended about and difficult to be known. And therefore this can be but a very uncertain rule of human practice, and serve but very little to the conduct of our lives, and is therefore very unfit to be assigned as an innate practical principle. For let us consider this proposition as to its meaning, for it is the sense and not the sound that is and must be the principle and common notion, vis-a-vis virtue is the best worship of God, i.e. is most acceptable to him, which if virtue be taken as commonly it is for those actions which according to the different opinions of several countries are accounted laudable, will be a proposition so far from being certain that it will not be true. If virtue be taken for actions conformable to God's will or to the rule prescribed by God, which is the true and only measure of virtue, when virtue is used to signify that is in its own nature right and good, signify what is in its own nature right and good, then this proposition that virtue is the best worship of God will be most true and certain, but of little use in human life, since it will amount to no more than this, vis-a-vis, that God is pleased with the doing of what he commands, which a man may certainly know to be true without knowing what it is that God doth command, and so be as far from any rule or principle of his actions as he was before. And I think very few will take a proposition which amounts to no more than this, vis-a-vis, that God is pleased with the doing of what he himself commands, for an innate moral principle writ on the minds of all men, however true and certain it may be, since it teaches so little. Whatsoever does so will have reason to think hundreds of propositions innate principles, since there are many which have as good a title as this to be received as such, which nobody yet ever put into that rank of innate principles. So it seems like he's talking about tautologies here, and he's saying things like, well, he's basically, his principle can be summed as, it is good to do that which God commands, which Locke says is true, but the question is that a useful information? Is that, really that the content of that is dependent on what does God command? So Locke is saying that essentially without knowing what God commands, that principle in itself doesn't contain any information. I guess the response of a rationalist would be something like, well, it's important at the most basic level that we understand that logic is somehow innate or imprinted in our minds. It is the foundation of equivalence that we can make logical statements. Locke has said elsewhere that this is not innate, that this is something that we learn through experience, that A equals A, something cannot both be and not be at the same time. So it's an interesting question, this question of, do we learn logic? Are we taught logic? Or is logic something that is intuitive? Is it a principle? Anyway, we just have to slog through it. Nor is the fourth proposition, vis-a-vis, men must repent of their sins, much more instructive, till what those actions are that are meant by sins be set down. For the word peccata, or sins, being put as it usually is to signify in general ill actions that will draw on punishment upon the doers, what great principle of morality can that be to tell us we should be sorry and cease to do that which will bring mischief upon us, without knowing what those particular actions are that will do so? Indeed, this is a very true exposition, and fit to be inculcated on and received by those who are supposed to have been taught what actions in all kinds are sins, but neither this nor the former can be imagined to be innate principles, nor to be of any use if they were innate, unless the particular measures and bounds of all virtues and vices were engraven in men's minds and were innate principles also, which I think is very much to be doubted. And therefore, I imagine, it will scarce seem possible that God should engrave principles in men's minds in words of uncertain signification, such as virtues and sins, which amongst different men stand for different things. Nay, it cannot be supposed to be in words at all, which, being in most of these principles very general names, cannot be understood, but by knowing the particulars comprehend under them. And in the practical instances, the measures must be taken from the knowledge of the actions themselves, and the rules of them abstracted from words, and antecedent to the knowledge of names, which rules a man must know, what language forever he chanced to learn, whether English or Japan, or if he should learn no language at all, or never should understand the use of words, as happens in the case of dumb and deaf men. When it shall be made out that men ignorant of words or untaught by the laws and customs of their country know that it is part of the worship of God not to kill another man, not to know more women than one, not to procure abortion, not to expose their children, not to take from another what is his, though we want it ourselves, but on the contrary, relieve and supply his wants. And whenever we have done the contrary, we ought to repent, be sorry, and resolve to do so no more. When I say all men shall be proved actually to know, and allow all these and 1,000 other such rules, all which come under these two general words made use of above, vis-a-vis virtutes et peccata, virtues and sins, there will be more reason for admitting these and the like for common notions and practical principles. Yet after all, universal consent, were there any in moral principles, to truths, the knowledge whereof may be attained otherwise, would scarce prove them to be innate, which is all I contend for. Nor will it be of much moment here to offer that very ready but not very material answer, vis-a-vis, that the innate principles of morality may by education and custom and the general opinion of those amongst whom we converse be darkened and at last quite worn out of the minds of men. Which assertion of theirs, if true, quite takes away the argument of universal consent, by which this opinion of innate principles is endeavored to be proved, unless those men will think it reasonable that their private persuasions, or that of their party, should pass for universal consent, a thing not unfrequently done when men, presuming themselves to be the only masters of right reason, cast by the votes and opinions of the rest of mankind as not worthy the reckoning. And then their argument stands thus: the principles which all mankind allow for true are innate, those that men of right reason admit are the principles allowed by all mankind. We and those of our own mind are men of reason, therefore we agreeing our principles are innate, which is a very pretty way of arguing, and a shortcut to infallibility, for otherwise it will be very hard to understand how there are some principles which all men do acknowledge and agree in, and yet there are none of those principles which are not by depraved custom and ill education blotted out of the minds of many men, which is to say that all men admit, but yet many men do deny, and different from them, and dissent from them. And indeed, the supposition of such first principles will serve us to very little purpose, and we shall be as much at a loss with as without them, if they may, by any human power, such as is the will of our teachers or opinions of our companions, be altered or lost in us. And notwithstanding all this boast of first principles and innate light, we shall be as much in the dark and uncertainty as if there were no such thing at all, it being all one to have no rule, and one that will warp any way or amongst various and contrary rules, not to know which is the right. And concerning innate principles, I desire these men to say whether they can or cannot, by education and custom, be blurred and blotted out. If they cannot, we must find in them all mankind alike, and they must be clear in everybody, and if they may suffer variation from adventitious notions, from notions outside, we must then find them clearest and most perspicuous. That's a new one. Perspicuous, nearest the fountain, in children and illiterate people who have received least impression from foreign opinions. Let them take which side they please, they will certainly find it inconsistent with visible matter of fact and daily observation. I easily grant that there are great numbers of opinions which, by men of different countries, educations, and tempers, are received and embraced as first and unquestionable principles, many whereof, both for their absurdity as well as oppositions one to another, it is impossible should be true. Yet, all those propositions, how remote soever from reason, are so sacred somewhere or other that men even of good understanding in other matters will sooner part with their lives and whatever is dearest to them than suffer themselves to doubt or others to question the truth of them. This, however strange it may seem, is that which every day's experience confirms, and will not perhaps appear so wonderful if we consider the ways and steps by which it is brought about, and how really it may come to pass that doctrines that have been derived from no better original than the superstition of a nurse, or the authority of an old woman, may, by length of time and consent of neighbors, grow up to the dignity of principles in religion or morality, for such who are careful, as they call it, to principle children well, and few there be who have not a set of those principles for them which they believe in, instill into the unwary and as yet unprejudiced understanding, for white paper receives any characters, those doctrines they would have them retain and profess, these being taught them as soon as they have any apprehension, and still as they grow up confirmed to them, either by the open profession or tacit consent of all they have to do with, or at least by those of whose wisdom, knowledge, and piety they have an opinion. But never suffer, never suffer those propositions to be otherwise mentioned, but as the basis and foundation on which they build their religion of manners, come by these means to have the reputation of unquestionable, self-evident, and innate truths. To which we may add that when men so instructed are grown up and reflect on their own minds, they cannot find anything more ancient there than those opinions which were taught them before their memory began to keep a register of their actions, or date the time when any new thing appeared to them, and therefore make no scruple to conclude that those propositions of whole knowledge they can find in themselves no original, were certainly the impress of God and nature upon their minds, and not taught them by anyone else. These they entertain and submit to, as many do to their parents, with veneration, not because it is natural, nor do children do it where they are not so taught, but because, having been always so educated, and having no remembrance of the beginning of this respect, they think it is natural. This will appear very likely and almost unavoidable to come to pass if we consider the nature of mankind and the constitution of human affairs, wherein most men cannot live without employing their time in the daily labors of their calling, nor be at quiet in their minds without some foundation or principles to rest their thoughts on. There is scarce anyone so floating and superficial in his understanding who hath not some reverenced propositions, which are to him the principles on which he bottoms his reasoning, and by which he judgeth of truth and falsehood, right and wrong, which some wanting skill and leisure, and others the inclination, and some being taught that they ought not examine, there are few to be found who are not exposed by their ignorance, laziness, education, or precipitancy to take them upon truth. What does precipitancy mean? Precipitancy. I don't know. Is that like precipitation? Suddenness or rashness of action. Okay. Precipitancy. This is evidently the case of all children and young folks, and custom, a greater power than nature, seldom failing to make them worship for divine what she hath inured them to bow their minds and submit their understandings to. It is no wonder that grown men, either perplexed in the necessary affairs of life or hot in the pursuit of pleasures, should not seriously sit down to examine their own tenets, especially when one of their principles is that principles ought not to be questioned, and had been leisure parts and will, who is there almost that dare shake the foundation of all his past thoughts and actions, and endure to bring upon himself the shame of having been a long time wholly in mistake and error? Who is there hardy enough to contend with the reproach which is everywhere prepared for these who dare venture to dissent from the received opinions of their country or party? And where is the man to be found that can patiently prepare himself to bear the name of whimsical, skeptical, or atheist, which he is sure to meet with, who does in the least scruple any of the common opinions? And he will be much more afraid to question those principles when he shall think them, as most men do, the standard set up by God in his mind to be the rule and touchstone of all other opinions. And what can hinder him from thinking them sacred when he finds them the earliest of his own thoughts and the most reverenced by others? So very interesting here that we're getting into atheism, skepticism. We're thinking of Socrates. We're thinking of Nietzsche and the concept of nihilism. This is very interesting territory. We're getting into the questioning of all principles. It is easy to imagine how by these means it comes to pass that men worship the idols that have been set up in their minds, grow fond of the notions they have been long acquainted with there, and stamp the characters of divinity upon absurdities and errors, become zealous votaries to bulls and monkeys, and contend to fight and die in defense of their opinions. Dum solos credit habendos esse deos quos ipse colit. For since the reasoning faculties of the soul, which are almost constantly, though not always warily nor wisely employed, would not know how to move for want of a foundation and footing, in most men who, through laziness or avocation, do not, or for want of time or true helps, or for other causes, cannot penetrate into the principles of knowledge and trace truth to its foundation and origin, 'tis natural for them and almost unavoidable to take up with some borrowed principles, which being reputed and presumed to be the evident proofs of other things, are thought not to need any other proofs themselves. Whoever shall receive any of these into his mind and entertain them there with the reverence usually paid to principles, never venturing to examine them, but accustoming himself to believe them because they are to be believed, may take up from his education and the fashions of his country any absurdity for innate principles, and by long poring on the same object so dim his sight as to take monsters lodged in his own brain for the images of the deity and the workmanship of his own hands. By this progress, how many there are who arrive at principles which they believe innate may be easily observed in the variety of opposite principles held and contended for by all sorts and degrees of men. And he that shall deny this to be the method wherein most men proceed to the assurance they have of the truth and evidence of their principles will perhaps find it a hard matter any other way to account for the contrary tenets which are firmly believed, confidently asserted, and which great numbers are ready at any time to seal with their blood. And indeed, if it be the privilege of innate principles to be received upon their own authority, without examination, I know not what may be believed or how anyone's principles can be questioned. If they may and ought to be examined and tried, I desire to know how first any innate principles can be tried, or at least it is reasonable to demand the marks and characters whereby the genuine innate principles may be distinguished from others, that so, amidst the great variety of pretenders, I may be kept from mistakes in so material a point as this. When this is done, I shall be ready to embrace such welcome and useful propositions. Until then, I may with modesty doubt, since I fear universal consent, which is the only one produced, will scarce prove a sufficient mark to direct my choice and assure me of any innate principles. From what has been said, I think it past doubt that there are no practical principles wherein all men agree, and therefore none innate. So, of course, I continue to agree that innateness and universality are two things to be conflated, but we have reached the beginning of chapter 4, therefore we have beat, I believe that's level 2. I think we considered the first chapter to be the tutorial, and this would be level 2. So let's check, see how the chat is doing. Reminds me of Corinthians, Romans, where Paul is talking about how Abraham was not awarded righteousness by his mechanical conformity to God's command, that he carried out the actions demanded of him, rather that he trusted God in his heart. He's not serious about reading through all of this, is he? Virtue, yeet, God is epic, happy face, reminder with every like button. Reminder that with every like button, Kenneth is closer to getting patronage from Susan. That's true. We have 13 viewers, 7 likes. With every like that is pressed, Susan grows closer to my heart or something. I'm closer to getting that clout. I need to ask Susan out on a date. Grin, big guy, better listen up. Locke in the house, or else you will get the wrong ideas. Logic is causality. Even animals have an understanding of as much. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Logic is causality. Do animals understand logic? Do they understand logic? What does that exactly mean? Animals understand logic. Do they understand it, or do they adhere to its principles accidentally according to their instincts? Do their instincts in a Darwinian fashion drive them in accordance with logic, yet they lack the understanding of logic itself? You know, the animal who presses the button in order to receive a treat, do they understand the concept of causality, or have their instincts arrange themselves in such a Pavlovian way as to cause the synchronicity between action and reaction? I think we can look in chemistry and we can see action and reaction. Does that mean the molecule has an understanding of causality simply because it acts in accordance with causality? Does learning require understanding? So if I can teach a computer something which rests upon causality, so for instance, I can create a software computer program in which I put in a credit card and then I receive cash out of an ATM, that there's a causal chain going on there, but does that mean the ATM software understands the concept of causality? So that's a different question. Yes, of course, animals act according to causality. They can learn tricks. They can learn from their environment. But does learning itself, is that evidence of a knowledge of causality, that they understand? What is this concept of understanding? Yes, they act as if they understand causality, but is actions which are in accordance with a theoretical understanding, are those actions actually evidence of a conscious understanding? Locke writes that understanding for him is predicated upon consciousness, that we cannot have understanding without having consciousness. So, what is logic? I'm asking for my hamster. I think the basic one Locke talks about is something cannot both be and not be simultaneously. A sit down, propositional logic, modus ponens, is a rule of inference. It can be summarized as P implies Q, and P is asserted to be true, therefore Q must be true. Feeling like I've disturbed the librarian, this is a capital offense. Sargon would be proud. I have no reason. Are you assuming my logic? Are you assuming my reason? Okay, I realize I could have wrote this stuff myself. Is that concerning? Well, maybe you should write a book, guy. This requires a big brain man of ideas like Manic Bibler or Melchizedek, a legit English philosopher, and big smart bobblehead sized brain guy. Okay, well, I haven't seen him lately. I think maybe he's decided to decamp. I don't know. I don't know what's up with the whole crew, the Melchizedek circle, where they're at, what they think about all this. That this truth might be recognized, I have yet endeavored to make 20 arguments, where but one would have sufficed my Lockean thoughts on this chapter. It must be an abnormal head. Atheists and skeptics, BTFO. I actually don't know if he's BTFOing atheists and skeptics here. He actually sounds, he's actually making the claim that atheism and skepticism are slur words that are used to defend the concept of innate principles, whereas he defends the skepticism of innate principles. So he's sort of implicitly defending atheists here, which is of course why the bishop has a problem with him, but he's doing so sneakily, and he's saying, well, I'm not an atheist, but people are wrongly calling people atheists who question the concept of innate principles. Damn, dying for opinions, that's a hill not worth dying on. Some thinking must be done, though, and then pen it after that, you might be undead. Cheers. Okay, cheers. We got through the chat. Now, I want to start chapter 4. I think I have, depending on when I get a notification here, I'm going to either have 5 more minutes or I'm going to have 30 more minutes or something. Before I jump into this chapter and I'm rudely interrupted, okay, let me say, ba-ba, ba-ba, okay, so we'll probably get a notification at some point concerning any interruptions we might receive. And like I said, it could be in 5 minutes, it could be in an hour, I'm not quite sure yet. But we're waiting for something to happen. In the meantime, we will begin chapter 4. Other considerations concerning innate principles, both speculative and practical. And we are on page 94, if you are reading along. Had those who would persuade us that there are innate principles not taken them together in gross, but considered separately the parts out of which those propositions are made, they would not perhaps have been so forward to believe they were innate, since if the ideas which made up those truths were not, it was impossible that the propositions made up of them should be innate, or our knowledge of them be born with us. For if the ideas be not innate, there was a time when the mind was without those principles, and then they will not be innate, but be derived from some other original. For where the ideas themselves were not, there can be no knowledge, no assent, no mental or verbal propositions about them. If we will attentively consider newborn children, we shall have little reason to think that they bring many ideas into the world with them, forbating perhaps some faint ideas of hunger and thirst and warmth, and some pains which they may have felt in the womb. There is not the least appearance of any settled ideas at all in them, especially of ideas answering the terms which make up those universal propositions that are esteemed innate principles. One may perceive how by degrees afterwards ideas come into their minds, and that they get no more nor no other than what experience and observation of things that come in their way furnish them with, which might be enough to satisfy us that they are not original characters stamped on the mind. It is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be, is certainly, if there is any such, an innate principle. But can anyone think, or will anyone say, that impossibility and identity are two innate ideas? Are they such as all mankind have, and bring into the world with them? And are they those that are the first in children and antecedent to all acquired ones? If they are innate, they must needs be so. Hath a child an idea of impossibility and in identity? Identity? Is this different from identity? Or is this a misspelling? I think this is a misspelling. Before it has of white or black, sweet or bitter. And it is from the knowledge of this principle that it concludes that wormwood rubbed on the nipple hath not the same taste that it used to receive from thence. It is the actual knowledge of impossible. Oh, we've got some Latin here. Impossibile est idem esse et non esse, that makes a child distinguish between its mother and a stranger, or that makes it fond of the one and fly the other? Or does the mind regulate itself and its assent by ideas that it never yet had? Or the understanding draw conclusions from principles which it never yet knew or understood? The names impossibility and identity stand for two ideas, so far from being innate or born with us, that I think it requires great care and attention to form them right in our understanding. They are so far from being brought into the world with us, so remote from the thoughts of infancy and childhood, that I believe upon examination it will be found that many grown men want them. If identity, to instance in that alone, be a native impression, and consequently so clear and obvious to us that we must needs know it, even from our cradles, I would gladly be resolved, by one of 7 or 70 years old, whether a man, being a creature consisting of soul and body, be the same man when his body is changed, whether Euphorbus and Pythagoras, having had the same soul, were the same man, though they lived in several ages asunder. Nay, whether the cockatoo, which had the same soul, were not the same with both of them. Whereby, perhaps, it will appear that our idea of sameness is not so settled and clear as to deserve to be thought innate in us. For if those innate ideas are not clear and distinct, so as to be universally known and naturally agreed on, they cannot be subjects of universal and undoubted truths, but will be the unavoidable occasion of perpetual uncertainty. For I suppose everyone's idea of identity will not be the same that Pythagoras and thousands of others of his followers have, and which then shall be the truth, which innate? Or are there two different ideas of identity, both innate? Nor let anyone think that the questions I have here proposed about the identity of man are bare, empty speculations, which, if they were, would be enough to show that there was in the understandings of men no innate idea of identity. He that shall with a little attention reflect on the resurrection and consider that divine justice shall bring to judgment at the last day the very same persons, to be happy or miserable in the other, who did well or ill in this life, will find it perhaps not easy to resolve with himself what makes the same man, or wherein identity consists, and will not be forward to think he and everyone, even children themselves, have naturally a clear idea of it. Let us examine that principle of mathematics, vis-a-vis that the whole is bigger than a part. This, I take it, is reckoned among innate principles. I am sure it has as good a title as any to be thought so, which yet nobody can think it to be, when he considers the ideas it comprehends in that whole and part are perfectly relative, but the positive ideas to which they properly and immediately belong are extension and number, of which alone whole and part are relations, so that if whole and part are innate ideas, extension and number must be so too, it being impossible to have an idea of a relation without having any at all of the thing to which it belongs and in which it is founded. Now, whether the minds of men have naturally imprinted on them the ideas of extension and number, I leave to be considered by those who are the patrons of innate principles. That God is to be worshipped is, without doubt, as great a truth as any can enter into the mind of man, and deserves the first place among all practical principles. But yet, it can by no means be thought innate unless the ideas of God and worship are innate. That the idea the term worship stands for is not in the understanding of children, and a character stamped in the mind in its first original, I think will be easily granted by anyone that considers how few there be amongst grown men who have a clear, distinct notion of it. And I suppose there cannot be anything more ridiculous than to say that children have this practical principle innate, that God is to be worshipped, and yet they know not what this worship of God is, which is their duty, but to pass by this. If any idea can be imagined innate, the idea of God may, of all others, for many reasons, be thought so, since it is hard to conceive how there should be innate moral principles without an innate idea of a deity. Without a notion of a lawmaker, it is impossible to have a notion of a law and an obligation to observe it. Besides, the atheists taken notice of amongst the ancients, and left branded upon the records of history, hath not navigation discovered, in these later ages, whole nations at the bay of Soldania, in Brazil, in Borande, and the Caribbee Islands, among whom there was to be found no notion of a god, no religion. Nicolaus de Techno in literis ex paraquaria de caeguarum conversione has these words: reperi eam gentem nullum nomen habere quod Deum et hominis animam significet, nulla sacra habet, nulla idola. These are instances of nations where uncultivated nature has been left to itself without the help of letters and discipline and the improvements of art and sciences. Looks like there's some bunch of numbers over there, citations in the margins. But there are others to be found who have enjoyed these in a very great measure, yet who, for want of a due application of their thoughts this way, want the idea and knowledge of God. 'Twill, I doubt not, be a surprise to others, as it was to me, to find the Siamites of this number. But for this, let them consult the King of France's late envoy thither, who gives no better account of the Chinese themselves. And if we will not believe La Loubere, the missionaries of China, even the Jesuits themselves, the great encomiasts of the Chinese. What is an encomiast? Oh, down here. Encomiast. What is an encomiast of the Chinese? A person who publicly praises or flatters someone else. Okay, so the Jesuits are the great encomiasts of the Chinese. Do all to a man agree, and will convince us that the sect of the literati or learned, keeping to the old religion of China and the ruling party there, are all of them atheists. So look at Navarrete in the collection of Voyages, Volume 1, Historia Cultus Cinesium. And perhaps if we should with attention mind the lives and discourses of people not so far off, we should have too much reason to fear that many in more civilized countries have no very strong and clear impressions of a deity upon their minds, and that the complaints of atheism made from the pulpit are not without reason. And though only some profligate wretches own it too barefacedly now, yet perhaps we should hear more than we do of it from others. Did not the fear of the magistrate's sword or their neighbor's censure tie up people's tongues, which, were the apprehensions of punishment or shame taken away, would as openly proclaim their atheism as their lives do. On this reasoning of the author against innate ideas, great blame hath been laid, because it seems to invalidate an argument commonly used to prove the being of a God, vis-a-vis universal consent, to which our author answers in his third letter to the Bishop of Worcester, page 147. I think that the universal consent of mankind as to the being of a God amounts to thus much, that the vastly greater majority of mankind have in all ages of the world actually believed a God, that the majority of the remaining part have not actually disbelieved it, and consequently those who have actually opposed the belief of a God have truly been very few. So that comparing those that actually have actually disbelieved with those who have actually believed a God, their number is so inconsiderable that in respect of this incomparably greater majority of those who have owned the belief of a God, it may be said to be the universal consent of mankind. This is all the universal consent which truth or matter of fact will allow, and therefore all can be made use of to prove a God. But if anyone would extend it farther and speak deceitfully for God, if this universality should be urged in a strict sense, not for much the majority, but for a great consent of everyone, even to a man, in all ages and countries, this would make it either no argument or a perfectly useless and unnecessary one. For if anyone denies a God such a perfectly universality of consent, what the heck is going on? Consent is destroyed, and if nobody does deny a God, what need of arguments to convince atheists? I would crave leave to ask your lordship, were there ever in the world any atheists or no? If there were not, what need is there of raising a question about the being of a God when nobody questions it? What need of provisional arguments against a fault from which mankind are so wholly free, and by which a universal consent they may be presumed to be secure from? If you say, as I doubt not, but you will, that there have been atheists in the world, then your lordship's universal consent reduces itself to only a great majority, and then makes that majority as great as you will. What I have said in the place quoted by your lordship leaves it in its full force. And I have not said one word that does in the least invalidate this argument for a God. The argument I was upon there was to show that the idea of God was not innate, and to my purpose it was sufficient if there were but a less number found in the world who had no idea of God than your lordship will allow there have been of professed atheists, for whatsoever is innate must be universal in the strictest sense. I just disagree with that. I don't know where Locke defends that concept, which is so often referred to and very problematic. One exception is a sufficient proof against it, so that all that I said, and which was quite to another purpose, did not at all tend, nor can be made use of to invalidate the argument for a deity, grounded on such universal consent as your lordship, and all that build on it, must own, which is only a very disproportioned majority. Such an universal consent my argument there neither affirms nor requires to be less than you will be pleased to allow it. Your lordship therefore might, without any prejudice to those declarations of goodwill and favor you have for the author of the Essay of Human Understanding, have spared the mentioning his quoting authors that are in print for matters of fact to quite another purpose, as going about to invalidate the argument for a deity from the universal consent of mankind, since he leaves that universal consent as entire and as large as you yourself do, or can own, or suppose it. But here I have no reason to be sorry that your lordship has given me this occasion for the vindication of this passage of my book. If there should be anyone besides your lordship who should so far mistake it as to think it in the least invalidates the argument for a God from the universal consent of mankind. But because you question the credibility of those authors I have quoted, which you say were very ill chosen, I will crave leave to say that he whom I relied on for his testimony concerning the Hottentots of Soldania was no less a man than an ambassador from the King of England to the Great Mogul, of whose relation Monsieur Thevenant, no ill judge in the case, had so great an esteem that he was at the pains to translate it into French and publish it in his, which is counted no injudicious, collection of travels, but to intercede with your lordship for a little more favorable allowance of credit to Sir Thomas Roe's relation, Core, an inhabitant of the country who could speak English, assured Mr. Terry that they of Soldania had no God. But if he too have the ill luck to find no credit with you, I hope you will be a little more favorable to a divine of the Church of England, now living, and admit of his testimony in confirmation of Sir Thomas Rose, this worthy gentleman, in the relation of his voyage to Surat, printed but 2 years since, speaking of the same people, has these words: they are sunk even below idolatry, are destitute of both priest and temple, and saving a little show of rejoicing, which is made at the full and new moon, have lost all kind of religious devotion. Nature has been so richly provided for their convenience in this life that they have drowned all sense of the God of it, and are grown quite careless of the next. But to provide against the clearest evidence of atheism in these people, you say, that the account given of them makes them not fit to be a standard for the sense of mankind. Here the bishop is really getting into something. This concept of mankind, is this a universal concept, or are there differentiations within mankind in which we can find separate instances of innate ideas? Will Locke consider this argument? This, I think, may pass for nothing, till somebody may be found that makes them to be a standard for the sense of mankind. All the use I have made of them was to show that there were men in the world that had no innate idea of God. But to keep something like an argument going, for what will not that do? You go near denying these coffers to be men. I'm not sure what the word here, kosers or coffers. You deny them to be men. What else do these words signify? A people so strangely bereft of common sense that they can hardly be reckoned among mankind, as appears by the best accounts of the kafirs. I think that's relating to the Islamic term kafir. So the kafirs of Soldania. Where is Soldania, by the way? Grab my keyboard here. Bring this up here. Soldania. I'm guessing Soldania is a bay which is in South Africa. It is mentioned in John Locke's 2 treatises of government, and talks about a reference to Soldania. It was named after Antonio de Saldanha, who visited in 1503. Interesting. Soldania. So it is in South Africa. Okay. So I'm guessing that means kafir, meaning is not Islamic, I suppose. A people so strangely bereft. I hope if any of them were called Peter, James, or John, it would be past scruple that they were men. However, Kor, Wewuwa, and Kau Saheda, and those others who had names that had no places in your nomenclature would hardly pass muster with your lordship. So I guess Locke is arguing against the racism of the bishop here, the xenophobia of the bishop, and not accepting these people into mankind just because they have different names than Peter, James, or John. My lord, I should not mention this, but that what you yourself say here may be a motive to you to consider, that what you have laid such a stress on concerning the general nature of man as a real being, and the subject of properties, amounts to nothing for the distinguishing of species, since you yourself own that there may be individuals subterranean. What does this mean? Individuals something. I can't read that word. It looks like numberine or something. There is a common nature with a particular subsistence proper to such of them, wherein you are so little able to know of which of the ranks or sorts they are, into which you say God has ordered beings, and which he hath distinguished by essential properties, that you are in doubt whether they ought to be reckoned among mankind or so. Remember, this is just a footnote. Okay, did we reach the end of the footnote? Okay. Let's scroll all the way back to the beginning of the footnote. Here we are. Okay. Footnote, where does the footnote start? Footnote starts apparently... Oh, no, we've been going for several pages with this footnote. Jeez, the footnote, it's amazing. Okay, where did the footnote come from? So we were talking about atheism, and then we went into this nice little footnote here. Okay, we are on page 99, close to 100. But had all mankind everywhere a notion of God, whereof yet history tells us the contrary, it would not from thence follow that the idea of him was innate. For though no nation were to be found without a name, and some few dark notions of him, yet that would not prove them to be natural impressions on the mind, no more than the names of fire or the sun, heat or number do prove the ideas they stand for to be innate, because the names of those things and the ideas of them are so universally received and known amongst mankind. Nor on the contrary is the want of such a name, or the absence of such a notion out of men's mind, any argument against the being of God, any more than it would be a proof that there was no lodestone in the world, because a great part of mankind had neither a notion of any such thing, nor a name for it, or be any shew of argument to prove that there are no distinct and various species of angels or intelligent beings above us, because we have no ideas of such distinct species. So we're talking about aliens there. We're talking about aliens here in Locke. Or names for them, for men being furnished with words by the common language of their own countries can scarce avoid having some kind of ideas of those things, whose names those they converse with have occasion frequently to mention them. And if it carry with it the notion of excellency, greatness, or something extraordinary, if apprehension and concernment accompany it, or if the fear of absolute and irresistible power set it upon the mind, the idea is likely to sink the deeper and spread the farther, especially if it be such an idea as is agreeable to the common light of reason, and naturally deducible from every part of our knowledge, as that of a God is. For the visible marks of extraordinary wisdom and power appear so plainly in all the works of the creation, that a rational creature who will but seriously reflect on them cannot miss the discovery of a deity, and the influence that the discovery of such a being must necessarily have on the minds of all that have but once heard of it is so great and carries such a weight of thought. There's our footnote. Such a weight of thought and communication with it, that it seems stranger to me that a whole nation of men should be anywhere found so brutish as to want the notion of a God, than that they should be without any notion of numbers or fire. The name of God being once mentioned in any part of the world, to express a superior, powerful, wise, invisible being, the suitableness of such a notion to the principles of common reason, and the interest men will always have to mention it often, must necessarily spread it far and wide, and continue it down to all generations, though yet the general reception of this name and some imperfect and unsteady notions conveyed thereby to the unthinking part of mankind proved not the idea to be innate, but only that they who made the discovery had made a right use of their reason, thought maturely of the causes of things, and traced them to their original, from whom other less considering people, having once received so important a notion, it could not easily be lost again. Footnote there. This is all could be inferred from the notion of a God, were it to be found universally in all the tribes of mankind, and generally acknowledged by men grown to maturity in all countries. For the generality of the acknowledging of a God, as I imagine, is extended no farther than that, which, if it be sufficient to prove the idea of God innate, will as well prove the idea of fire innate, since I think it may be truly said that there is not a person in the world who has a notion of a God who has not also the idea of fire. I doubt not, but if a colony of young children should be placed in an island where no fire was, they would certainly neither have any notion of such a thing, nor name for it, how generally soever it were received, and known in all the world besides, and perhaps too their apprehensions would be as far removed from any name or notion of a God, till some one amongst them had employed his thoughts to inquire into the constitution and causes of things, which would easily lead him to the notion of a God, which having once taught to others reason and the natural propensity of their own thoughts, would afterwards propagate and continue amongst them. So we're kind of deviating from Plato's concept that we are remembering the truth from a past life, and we're going into Aristotle's empiricism here. Indeed, it is urged that it is suitable to the goodness of God to imprint upon the minds of men characters and notions of himself, and not to leave them in the dark and doubt in so grand a concernment, and also by that means to secure to himself the homage and veneration due from so intelligent a creature as man, and therefore he has done it. Okay, so I will be having to leave in the next 5 minutes. So we're going to stop it there at page 102. And we are going to speed through the chat. Not waiting for the booty call. That is not true. I saw a message was retracted. The Hottentots are the indigenous South Africans. Sub to Autistic Mercury to listen to Cantbot's podcast. Anyone a fan of the old Cantbot best episodes, I want to burn through them and unsub. You can listen to most of them for free on Shout Engine. Subscription is only to get access to exclusive episodes. He has episodes open to the public, plenty. Okay, so that's it for today. We got 12 viewers, 9 likes. We got to page 102. That is all, and we will end it there.